Pastor Thomas Reed was the man everyone trusted, charming, respected, and adored by his congregation, while Vanessa Moore, his devoted secretary, quietly worshipped him in ways no sermon could justify. But when love turned into betrayal and faith twisted into fury, Vanessa's heartbreak transformed into something far more dangerous. In a shocking act of revenge, she would destroy not only the man who ruined her life, but the holy image he built around himself. One secret at a time. Grace Chapel sat at the heart of a quiet southern town where everyone knew everyone else, and Sunday mornings were sacred. It wasn't just a church, it was the soul of the community. Families dressed in their best clothes, children ran across the church lawn, and the air always smelled faintly of fresh-cut grass and perfume. The people who gathered there didn't just come to pray, they came to belong, and leading them was Pastor Thomas Reed, a man whose charm seemed almost divine. He was the kind of person who remembered every name, every struggle, every birthday. His sermons weren't just words from the Bible, they were stories that made people cry, laugh, and believe. To most, he was a man without flaws, a husband, a father, a spiritual guide, and the living example of what faith could look like. But behind every successful man, there was someone quietly holding the pieces together, and for Pastor Reed, that person was Vanessa Moore. She was 32, sharp-minded, and tirelessly loyal. As the pastor's secretary, Vanessa handled everything from financial records to community events. Her small office was often cluttered with church bulletins, donation envelopes, and half-empty coffee cups, a sign of her endless workload. The congregation adored her, often saying the church would fall apart without her. She had a warm smile, a patient voice, and a presence that made people feel heard. But behind her calm exterior was a woman who had endured more than most realized. Vanessa had come to Grace Chapel after escaping a toxic relationship. She was raising her young son alone and saw the church as a fresh start. Over time, she grew close to Pastor Reed, not intentionally at first. He had been kind to her when others weren't, offering advice, prayer, and comfort. Their bond deepened through shared moments, planning sermons late at night, comforting grieving families together, and traveling for church conferences. The connection began as professional respect, but slowly blurred into something unspoken. The congregation noticed subtle changes long before either of them did. Vanessa started wearing brighter clothes, fixing her hair differently, and staying long after everyone had gone home. Pastor Reed seemed lighter, happier, almost glowing when she was around. People whispered, but they were whispers coated with denial. How could a man like Pastor Reed, the perfect husband and preacher, ever be caught in something so scandalous? The town dismissed the gossip as cruel talk, the kind that comes from jealousy. To outsiders, everything appeared flawless. On Sundays, Pastor Reed stood tall behind the pulpit, preaching about forgiveness, purity, and grace. His wife Carol sat in the front pew, her hands folded neatly in her lap, smiling with quiet pride. Vanessa moved efficiently through the service, organizing programs and collecting donations. They played their roles so well that even if anyone sensed tension, they ignored it. But beneath the polite smiles and carefully chosen words, a storm was forming. Vanessa's admiration for the pastor had begun to turn into something deeper, something dangerous. She looked at him not as a man of God, but as the man who made her feel seen, valued, and loved. And though he knew the line between righteousness and sin, Pastor Reed found himself crossing it one step at a time. Grace Chapel remained unaware that the seeds of its destruction had already been planted. Quietly, behind the church's perfect image. The first time Pastor Reed and Vanessa crossed the line, it was a moment born out of weakness rather than intent. A late-night meeting turned into a quiet confession of feelings, and one gentle touch became a secret they could never take back. From that night on, their relationship changed forever. What began as an affair rooted in secrecy quickly grew into an obsession for Vanessa. She had fallen deeply, entirely, and dangerously in love with him. He wasn't just her pastor anymore. He was her world, her comfort, her only sense of belonging. She believed every word he said, especially the ones whispered when the rest of the world was asleep. He told her she was special, that what they shared was different, that someday he would make things right. For months they lived in a bubble of stolen moments and silent promises. Vanessa rearranged her life around his schedule, waiting for late-night calls and quick visits between sermons. She kept his secrets like sacred scripture, convinced their love was something pure, even if the world would never understand. In her eyes, they were bound by something deeper than sin, a love strong enough to survive judgment. But Pastor Reed saw things differently. To him, it was a temptation he couldn't resist, but also couldn't acknowledge. He compartmentalized it, convincing himself he could sin in secret and still stand behind the pulpit as a man of God. The guilt began to eat at him, but the fear of losing his reputation was stronger than his conscience. He knew what would happen if the truth came out. The church would fall apart, his wife would leave, and his image would be destroyed. And so, instead of ending it honestly, he began to distance himself from Vanessa, slowly and cruelly. Her texts went unanswered, her calls ignored, and her presence in the church suddenly felt unwelcome. She sensed the change long before he admitted it, but she clung to hope, telling herself he was just scared. The breaking point came one evening when Pastor Reed's wife, Carol, found a message on his phone, a message from Vanessa that left no room for doubt. The confrontation that followed was explosive, though the town never knew the details. The next morning, Pastor Reed stood before the church board, painting himself as a victim of a woman's obsession. He claimed Vanessa had misunderstood his kindness, that she had fabricated their relationship out of loneliness. Within days, Vanessa was called into a meeting and asked to resign. There was no investigation, no conversation, only quiet judgment and thinly veiled pity. He left the church that day with trembling hands and a broken heart. The same people who once hugged her now turned their faces away. She had given years of loyalty, only to be erased like a stain from the church's history. The humiliation was unbearable. Pastor Reed went back to preaching as if nothing had happened, delivering sermons about forgiveness while privately thanking himself for escaping exposure. But Vanessa couldn't move on. Each sermon he gave, each smiling photo of him and his wife, burned like acid in her memory. She had loved him, trusted him, and believed in him. And now, he had destroyed her reputation to save his own. At Betrayal was the moment something inside Vanessa broke. The woman who once lived for faith began to lose her belief in everything, in love, in trust, and in God. What replaced it was darker, quieter, and far more dangerous. A growing hunger for revenge. In the months that followed her forced resignation, Vanessa's life began to unravel piece by piece. The church that had once been her sanctuary became a place of humiliation. Friends who used to greet her warmly now crossed the street to avoid her. Her reputation was ruined, and whispers followed her wherever she went. She couldn't find another job. Every interview ended once they asked about her previous employer. The world that had once seemed full of hope now felt like a cage built from betrayal and shame. She tried to rebuild, focusing on her son and her faith, but even prayer began to feel empty. Nights were the hardest. She would lie awake replaying every word Pastor Reed had said, the promises, the tenderness, the lies. The betrayal festered inside her like an open wound that refused to heal. And then came the diagnosis that shattered what little strength she had left. During a routine doctor's visit, Vanessa learned she was HIV positive. The news hit her like a physical blow. At first she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't speak. Her body trembled as the doctor explained her options, but all she could hear was the sound of her own heart breaking. She sat in her car afterward, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror, feeling like a ghost of the woman she once was. Rage began to replace fear. She didn't know how it had happened, but the truth didn't matter anymore. In her mind, everything that had gone wrong in her life, The affair, the humiliation, the diagnosis, led back to one man, Pastor Thomas Reed. The man who had used her, abandoned her, and destroyed her name now stood every Sunday preaching about salvation and truth. He had escaped untouched, while she was left to die slowly in silence. Vanessa's thoughts grew darker with each passing week. What started as anger became obsession. She began to follow the church's social media page, watching photos of Pastor Reed smiling beside his wife. She drove past Grace Chapel late at night, parking just long enough to see the lights on inside. Every glimpse of his life reignited the fury burning inside her. She didn't want to forgive anymore. She wanted him to feel the same pain, the same humiliation, the same fear, the same destruction. At this point, was the sandwich a meal? Was the sandwich only lunch? Could she stop? Yes. Could she not? Did ideals abide in a... The plan formed slowly, almost naturally, as if revenge had been waiting for her to finally accept it. She reached out to him one evening, her message carefully worded and full of sorrow. She told him she forgave him, that she had been wrong to react out of anger, that she only wanted peace. The message played on his guilt, and it worked. Within days, he replied. He was cautious at first, but curiosity and pride made him agree to meet her. When they met, she was kind, calm, and remorseful. She spoke softly about forgiveness and faith, pretending to be the woman he once trusted. He believed her. Slowly, over the following weeks, their meetings became frequent again, hidden from everyone's eyes. The affair reignited under the guise of reconciliation, but this time Vanessa knew exactly what she was doing. She smiled at him, held his hand, and told him everything would be okay, knowing that every moment brought him closer to the punishment she had planned. What had once been love was now vengeance disguised as intimacy, and she was determined that he would pay for everything he had done. Several months after their secret meetings began again, Pastor Reed started to feel the first signs that something wasn't right. At first he brushed it off as exhaustion. The long sermons, late-night counseling sessions, and emotional stress of maintaining his image had always taken a toll, but this felt different. He began to lose weight rapidly, his appetite disappeared, and even climbing the church stairs left him breathless. His wife noticed the change and urged him to see a doctor. Reluctantly, he agreed, believing it would be something minor, perhaps stress or fatigue. But when the test results came back, his world collapsed in an instant. The diagnosis was clear. He was HIV positive. He sat in silence as the doctor spoke, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The words felt unreal, like a nightmare he couldn't wake from. He thought of his wife, his church, his reputation. How could this be possible? He had lived his life preaching purity and restraint. Fear consumed him, not just for his health, but for what would happen when people found out. The shame would be unbearable. The secrets he had buried so carefully were about to rise to the surface. In the following days, panic set in. He tried to trace how it had happened, searching for explanations that made sense. There was only one possibility: Vanessa. The realization hit him like a tidal wave. His heart pounded with dread and disbelief. He confronted her privately, demanding answers. She didn't deny it. Instead, she looked him in the eyes with a calmness that terrified him. To her, this wasn't a crime. It was justice. She told him he had ruined her life, and now she had evened the score. The confrontation marked the beginning of his public downfall. The health department began tracing his infection, and soon the investigation linked back to Vanessa. The quiet southern town that once adored its pastor was thrown into chaos. News spread like wildfire. Church members were horrified, reporters swarmed the chapel, and whispers turned into open outrage. Some refused to believe it, defending Pastor Reed as a victim of manipulation. Others called him a hypocrite who had hidden behind the Bible while living a double life. Within days, the once revered pastor's perfect image shattered. His wife, devastated by betrayal, packed her things and left. The church board forced him to step down, and Sunday services were replaced with angry meetings and arguments among the congregation. The man who once preached forgiveness now stood as the subject of public shame. Meanwhile, Vanessa faced her own reckoning. Authorities arrested her after confirming she had knowingly exposed the pastor to HIV. When questioned, she confessed without hesitation. She spoke about her pain, her humiliation, and how she had wanted him to feel what she felt, helpless and destroyed. Her lack of remorse stunned investigators, but in her mind she hadn't committed a sin. She had delivered retribution. As the story made national headlines, the small town became a symbol of moral failure hidden behind religious facades. Grace Chapel, once a beacon of faith, was now surrounded by flashing cameras and angry voices. Pastor Reed's life was in ruins, his career, his marriage, his reputation, all gone. What he didn't realize until it was too late was that the woman he had used and discarded had been quietly waiting for her moment of power, and when she struck, she didn't just take his health. She took the very thing he valued most, his image as a man of God. After the arrest, the quiet town that once worshipped Pastor Thomas Reed fell into a deep silence that felt heavier than any sermon he had ever preached. Grace Chapel, once filled with laughter, hymns, and community spirit, now stood like a haunted relic of its former self. The church board removed his photos from the lobby, erased his name from the website, and quietly replaced him with a temporary minister. But even with new leadership, the air carried a permanent stain of shame. No matter how many times the pews were scrubbed or how often the pulpit was polished, people couldn't forget what had happened. Pastor Reed's life outside those church walls was even more unbearable. He resigned publicly, issuing a statement of apology that the media quickly tore apart. Reporters painted him as a fallen preacher, a hypocrite who had lived a double life while preaching purity. His wife, Carol, finalized their divorce and moved away to start over. His children refused to speak to him. The home that once echoed with warmth and prayer now felt cold and hollow. Even his closest friends avoided him, afraid that being associated with him would damage their own reputations. He was a man stripped of everything: his health, his faith, and his identity. At first, he tried to hold on to what little dignity he had left. He volunteered quietly at a homeless shelter, avoiding cameras and gossip. But no matter where he went, people recognized his face. Some whispered cruel words. Others crossed the street. The illness progressed slowly, leaving him frail and exhausted. He stopped attending church entirely. The man who once guided others toward salvation could no longer find peace within himself. In his final interviews before retreating completely from public view, he admitted that he had lived with pride and denial, never imagining that his own sins would return to destroy him so completely. Vanessa Moore's story became just as infamous. Her trial drew national attention, with journalists calling it a scandal of faith and vengeance. The courtroom was packed every day. Some came to see the woman who had dared to strike back against a preacher, others to condemn her. She spoke calmly throughout, never raising her voice, never shedding a tear. To her, what she did wasn't evil. It was the only way to make him understand the pain she had endured. The judge saw it differently. Her deliberate act of revenge earned her a lengthy prison sentence. When she heard the verdict, she simply nodded, as if she had expected it all along. Years passed, and the town slowly began to move on, though the shadow of the scandal lingered like a scar that refused to fade. Grace Chapel reopened under new leadership, but attendance never fully recovered. Some members left the congregation entirely, saying they could no longer trust anyone behind the pulpit. Others stayed, determined to rebuild faith from the ashes of betrayal. For those who remembered the story, it was never just about sin or sickness. It was about power, hypocrisy, and the cost of revenge. Pastor Thomas Reed lost everything because of pride and deception, while Vanessa Moore destroyed herself in her pursuit of justice. Both believed they were right in their own way, but in the end, their choices consumed them. What had begun as a forbidden love between a pastor and his secretary ended as a chilling reminder that secrets, once exposed, can ruin not just lives, but entire communities.